Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. I want to talk a little bit about Marxism and some of the the contradictions of capitalism, as they're usually called. Which I want to take his statement. The general thesis, as he puts it, is that capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction, and I somewhat agree with what he's saying here, though. But hear me out. But it's a good thing, right? I just want to say, like, okay, let's just take that as if it were true, exactly what he said, literally, and how he means it. Fine, that's a good thing, right? You want capitalism to be gone, so let it sow its the seeds of its destruction. Even that, taken at face value, would mean you don't need a state, right? So, I'm gonna read some of this article from econlib.org. It's just called Marxism by David Prichitko. And he begins to talk about the contradictions of capitalism. So he says, Marx predicted that competition among capitalists would grow so fierce that eventually most capitalists would go bankrupt, leaving only a handful of monopolists controlling nearly all production. This, to Marx, was one of the contradictions of capitalism. Competition, rather than creating better quality products at lower prices for consumers, in the long run creates monopoly, which exploits workers and consumers alike. What happens to the former capitalists? They fall into the ranks of the proletariat, creating a greater supply of labor, a fall in wages, and what Marx called a growing reserve army of the unemployed. Also, thought Marx, the anarchic, unplanned nature of a complex market economy is prone to economic crises as supplies and demands become mismatched, causing huge swings in business activity and ultimately severe economic depressions. There's a lot in there, right? This guy did a really good job of basically summing up everything that's wrong with socialist thought. And how clearly Marx wasn't too favorable to anarchy, the anarchy of the market, which we do agree with that the market is anarchic, right? Market is anarchic. Did I say that right? But we don't agree with the conclusions, and we point to different causes of these swings, these booms and busts. Though it's not like things won't happen like that in the market naturally. It's anarchy. You can't guarantee what's going on out there or what's going to happen. But there's a lot to unpack there, and it's pretty deep, but it's not that complicated, right? So I will say that if we take his statement, it's really easy to take his statement and, okay. So number one, he's overlooking the fact that what would obviously have happened if we're at a point where there's a handful of, quote, monopolists who have won, quote, through competition, that so many other goods and services have become so cheap that he's just saying that supply and demand don't apply here, basically, right? So competition has resulted in a few firms. It's like, how far do you think you have to get for there only to be like one or two or a handful of firms controlling all production? Could you imagine how much production had advanced by the time that competition, if it were to occur naturally, not through state intervention or anything like that, or through taxation or anything, right? Because things can go a little faster at times if you violently appropriate capital and divert it to what the state wants, and then so the state is basically taking 50, 60, 100 million people's money and diverting it to one program or whatever they do. Sure, they could essentially have a lot of activity there. But, so, right, like he basically seems to be completely ignoring the fact that to get to that point, production would have had to have shot forward to the point where the prices have already fallen, right? Like competition through whatever chain of production you're looking at, if it gets to the point where we're not talking about an innovator, we could take a market that has a lot of competition right now and think of it in just the way of if that happened naturally through the economy, how long it would have to take and how cheap the price would have gotten by the point of having, by the time you get to the point that there's only one or a couple firms controlling whatever market it is. And of course, the point here too is that, another point obviously is that these people are always open to competition. Like, they have to sell their goods to someone, and they have to sell, they're going to hold on to their capital goods forever. Okay, sure, they might do that, but in the meantime, they still have to sell the commodities to perpetuate their own existence. So the commodities are still going to make it out into the consumer's hands by trade. And if the economy is that abundant, the capitalist is not going to be able to keep it expensive. He's just not going to be able to do that. That's not how it works. He could trash all of the stuff he wants, as long as he doesn't use the violence of the state to claim that nobody can compete. It's just never going to happen the way that this guy is envisioning this to happen, because somebody's going to get their hands on these commodities, since the capitalist has to sell the commodities, to get money. So somebody could backwards engineer this and compete with him. It's not going to be so impossible that this guy and this group is literally going to control everything involved in producing whatever commodity it is. Like the ore for the minerals that make the commodity or elsewhere. He's just, at what point do we have two companies controlling absolutely all aspects of production? He says nearly all production. It's just totally insane. It's never going to happen that way. And if it ever got to that point, commodities would be so abundant that they're practically free. It wouldn't even matter anyway that there's only one group. What are they going to do? They can't just be like, well, we're not going to sell our commodities, and now everybody's getting hungry, and now suddenly they're going to pay and some extortionate rate. It's like, no, they're not going to do that. That's not how any of this works. It's not going to happen that way. It's literally impossible. There was like a one in a, not even like, it's a 0.0001% chance in 5 gajillion that this would ever happen. It's just, there's too many people, there's too many other resources for it possibly to result in this. The capitalist has to sell his commodities. He has to sell things in order to continue to feed himself. So it's just, the goods are not going to be so scarce that this is going to be a problem, And so what else here is something else to unpack. Just the fact that, they note that the unplanned nature of a complex market economy is anarchic. That's basically what we're saying, but that's a good thing. And why is that a good thing? Because what you are saying here and what it implies is that each individual is making the decision for themselves how to use their time, their goods, their services, and so on. And groups are doing that as well voluntarily, not just humans, but only individuals act. That's true, but they act in tandem. So, to a socialist, that might sound crazy or whatever. Like, there's no groups. It's like, that's not what I mean. Groups of people will come together, but they're all still using their own reason to decide how best to use their own property. And because that is the best situation, and that results in what they call an anarchic, unplanned, complex market economy. But that, like I said, that's why that's a good thing, because you're recognizing each individual's right to control themselves and their property in the best way that they see fit, even if they make incorrect decisions. You cannot force someone to be correct like that. It's just, you can't know any better. How could you possibly know how best to spend this guy's money? It doesn't make any sense. But you could have insider information. You could see something coming in a trend that's coming, and you could have information, but you don't have the right, even in that situation, to force this person to use his time and his resources in the way that you think is best, even if it is the right decision in an economic context. It's so dangerous to even make that claim, though, because the right decision. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, what we mean is obviously the correct solution, the correct plan, but because it's anarchic, and because the economy is millions of people each using their own minds to make decisions regarding their time and property, there's no way that you could ever guarantee what's going to happen, right? But you could have a good idea based on some aspects of reality. But here's a way that this does make sense. And that is, the abundance that capitalism creates renders certain markets obsolete. And that's really the way that should be taken. That's the point that the socialists are missing. That's the point that it shows you that the state really isn't needed, and really what should happen is you should let capitalism create the abundance, because for the same reason that there's just no way it's ever going to end up like with a couple companies controlling nearly all production. Like, we might even think that it looks that way now with the way that the state monopolizes various aspects of the market, but even then, they don't have total control of nearly all production. People are making guns in their living rooms and things like this. It's just it's just not as dismal as the state is. It's not as dismal as communists think capitalism is. Like, they really think that like it's just like, man, we're a slave to like 3 people, you know. There's the 6 companies that control media, blah, 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 Sinclair. Okay, that's great. But we still have YouTube, and we still have social media, and people are still putting out all, you know, you could still get a radio and broadcast, a transmitter and broadcast to people who can literally pick it up with a $8 radio. You know, it's not as dismal as these socialists look at it. Though it is dismal. The state is quite dismal, and the situation we're in is grave, but it's not as bad as they're making this out to be, and it will never get that bad, because there's just simply no way for these people to control so many aspects of production unless you monopolize the market through the state. Because the monopolies that these guys are talking about are always open to competition, and they have to sell their goods. And they have to employ someone to fix their goods. So that's job employment too. That, you know, they're the army, the reserve army of the unemployed. I mean, the only way that's going to really happen that way is if you have the state meddling with the government or with the market and collectivizing all these resources into one group, or, you know, various splintered factions of basically one group, the state, and their corporate buddies and their socialist buddies, their union buddies, it doesn't matter who, but they're centralizing all the resources. They're telling people that they can't compete. That's who's doing it, is the state. If the capitalist so-called monopolists in this example ever did that, we'd be like, hey, these guys are terrorists. They're telling me that I can't start a business. But when the state does it, they're like, oh, good, they're smashing the monopoly or whatever. You know, they're completely backward. So, you know, it's not a contradiction of capitalism, though if you take it at face value, capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. In some ways that makes sense, but the way that it makes sense is the way that the socialists overlook, and that is the abundance that capitalism and market economies create. It creates more abundance and increases the standard of living for everyone involved, because the commodities are in the market and they're lower price. He says, and it's interesting, another point about this is he kind of just jumps to 2 different examples here, where he says, rather than creating better quality products at lower prices for consumers, in the long run creates monopoly. Well, in the long run, sure, after competition, you might end up with a few firms controlling a lot of aspects of production, but they did it voluntarily. They did it through beating the other people and offering better services to the consumers at a lower price. That's why the consumers went there. And hopefully, an example, they did so without fraud, and they did so without exploiting other people through the state and through taxes. And they, you know, hopefully they didn't get subsidies. They didn't enforce any patents. They didn't do any of the things that the corporatists do through the state to limit competition, because that's what's actually creating these monopolies and ending up with that. Because in the situation that they present, there's, you know, they don't even talk about that. They're just like, well, it's going to naturally happen, you know, but they don't talk about who's actually doing it in the sense of the violence. You know, these capitalists aren't saying you can't compete with me. They only do that through the state. The state's the only one viewed to have the right to do that. So, but he jumps from 2 different examples, because he rather than creating better quality products at lower prices of consumers, in the long run creates monopoly. So it's like he's almost overlooking the fact and the reality that during the time of all of this competition and people trying to provide better services at lower prices, the prices are falling. You know, they're ignoring that. They have to jump to this other in the long run, because they have to ignore the fact that by the time you're talking about this happening, the prices have already been locked so low that abundance has been created, therefore prices are lower. So living isn't as bad as they're making out to be, and then now you've only got 2 firms. Well, as long as those 2 firms or whatever don't tell you that you can't compete, it's not going to matter. They have to sell their commodities. They have to sell their commodities at the same lower price, or people are going to start competing again, right? Oh, they raise their price to from $5 to $12. Well, now I have an incentive to offer it for $8. And that's what's going to happen, because they don't have, if they wouldn't have the state meddling in everyone's affairs and telling people that they can't compete, the real problematic monopoly, as opposed to just the sole provider who arose through competition or who was the first one on the market with such a product or service, they wouldn't have that, that wouldn't be happening the way that it is. And it would never happen the way that they say, because they're assuming that the capitalist is just going to not sell goods or whatever until you get starving to the point that they can up the prices. Like, he becomes the only firm on the market and he ups his prices. Well, guess what? The other capitalists save some money and then they start offering that again. They get a hold of other capital goods. It's not like there's one company that owns all of the capital goods in all manner of production that exist on the planet. And here we are. Like, by the time that happens, there's going to be so many goods in circulation that it's not even going to matter what these people do, So it just goes to show that they really don't understand how trade works. They're not even understanding the implications of what they say and the implications that they overlook. So yeah, let the free market eat the rich, as it has been said by the so-called left market anarchists, but let the material abundance that capitalism creates render markets obsolete. Stop using the state to protect industries. Stop using the state to impose patents and tell people that they can't compete and all of this other stuff. And that you need a government license to cut people's hair and things like this. And you need a license for this and that and everything. Get rid of all of that. Abolish the state. That is what you do, is you let the free market eat the rich. You let the capital goods circulate. Even if they want to hold on to their capital goods to try to raise the price, it's not going to matter. People are going to compete. Abolish the state. End rant.